malam sharirasya cha vaidyakena yopakarotam pravaram muninam Patanjalim pranjaliranatosmi. Namaste and welcome to Kaivalya Yoga Gurukulam or KYG for yet another class in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. We learn this delightful sutra from yet another very ancient temple, rarely visited by people. It is known as the Satchinathar Shivan Kovil, where Shiva is the eternal witness. More of this temple in another video. But for now, let's get back to the sutras. In this sutra, Patanjali tells about what happens to those that are not videhas and prakriti layas. So this is a continuation of the previous sutra. In the previous sutra, we learnt about advanced yogis. We call them videhas, prakriti layas. And we learned how they, from the very time of their birth, begin to remember and they continue their spiritual journey towards total enlightenment. As we learn from Patanjali, we learn enlightenment is also in stages. Enlightenment, we call it, samādhi is another word for it. But that enlightenment happens in various stages. Right? First there is bookish learning, if you will, and then there is some element of experience, and then there is an element of transformation, and then comes the absorption stages, where slowly the little self begins to get absorbed in the supreme cosmic self. So we talked about advanced yogis in the previous sutras. But most of us would say, all right, we are not there. When the time of the birth, we didn't realize, we didn't remember anything. We have stumbled across these things. It's begun to interest us. We are spiritual aspirants, if you will. We are studying, we are in this path, we are journeying. In short, we really don't know whether we are advanced or not. So for the others, for those of us who are not very sure where we are in the spiritual progress, what is in store for us? What do we do then? And therefore, Patanjali explains that as well in the sutra. So let us see what this sutra and how it goes. The sutra goes like this. Śraddhā, vīrya, smṛtisamādhiprajñāpūrvaka, itareṣām. śraddhāvīryasmṛtisamādhiprajñāpūrvaka, itareṣām. Itareṣām, for others. Itareṣām means for all others. All others who are not videhas and prakriti layas. At that very advanced enlightened stage, or one step below enlightenment, if you will. For those who are not that, what happens? So here beautifully Patanjali lays out what Vyasa explains to us as a roadmap of what happens to these people. How do we take the first step and how this many steps come. So the words that he has used, let us understand the meaning of each of these words, and then we will understand the purport of this sutra, the essence of the sutra. Śraddhā, vīrya, smṛti, samādhi, prajñā. So there are 5 words. Śraddhā. What is śraddhā? Śraddhā means faith. Vīrya means vigor, energy. Smṛti. Smṛti means memory. Samādhi. Samadhi is that state of one-pointedness, trance, if you will, one-pointedness, if you will, a particular state of enlightenment, if you will. We learnt about samadhi as samprajñāta samādhi. So the cognitive trance is what he is referring to. So samadhi, and then prajñā. Prajñā means wisdom. In Vedas, one of the essential phrases of the entire Vedas, if they were to be summarized, they are summarized in 4 or 5, they are called Mahavakyas. One of them is Prajñānam Brahma. So the ultimate knowledge, prajñā, that is Brahma. The knowledge of Brahman is prajñā. So prajñānam. So here Patanjali has used the word prajñā. Prajñā is ultimate enlightenment. So cognitive trance and then finally ultimate enlightenment. So these are the 5 words he has used. Vyasa explains this as a roadmap, one leading to the other. They are not 5 random things that we need to consider. Oh, I need to have memory, I need to have vīrya or vigor in my practice, I need to have faith in my practice, and so on. Not necessarily random ideas, but it is more of a sequential pattern, the way he explains it. And Vyasa too adds that in that commentary. So perhaps the only input that we need to have is śraddhā. The first word that he uses in this aphorism, śraddhā. Śraddhā means faith. Faith, but there is an element of perseverance involved. So it's a perseverance with faith. Vishwas is another word for faith. Faith is more of an intellectual, mental, emotional concept, spiritual concept. But then when that begins to translate itself into sadhana, where we come to beautiful temples like this, we worship, we meditate, we take pilgrimages, or we do some sadhana, then that becomes śraddhā, because you're doing that with deep faith. Vyasa in his commentary says, this faith, unadulterated, unconditional faith, is like a mother that protects her newborn baby. So this faith will protect you from what? From obstacles in the yoga path, as explained by Vyasa to us. So both Patanjali and Vyasa, and of course many other teachers, have laid so much importance to this one component, śraddhā. Shirdi Sai Baba, one of the more modern saints and avatars, also tells us 2 words, śraddhā and saburi. Put all your efforts, but not without faith. So faith is such an important thing, śraddhā, faith. Then Vyasa explains this. He says, once you put that faith and into your practice, and that practice we know abhyasa, which is dirgha kala, long, nairantarya, which is constant, satakara, with enthusiasm, all of that is then we cultivating that practice with faith. Then what happens, he says, vīrya is presented to us. For those who are practicing with faith, vīrya comes in. Vīrya is, like I explained a couple of sutras ago, it is energy, it's action-oriented energy. It helps us to practice more and more. When I say practice, it is not necessarily that 1 hour meditation or 1 hour yogasanas or 1 hour of a ritual or whatever we do, but we begin to translate our lives, every thought, every word, every action begins to get streamed towards the spiritual path. We use everything that we do as offerings, and we make sure that values are all streamlined. The jobs we do, the friends we choose, the television shows we watch, the books we read, everything begins to get streamlined. That comes with vīrya. Vīryam is that shakti, that energy that begins to truly cross transformation. Vyasa says in his commentary that such vīryam comes to those who are earnestly and with faith seeking the highest knowledge at this stage, which is viveka khyati. Again, we touched upon this term as well. Viveka khyati is, viveka is the highest form of discernment, where you are able to discern what is Purusha and what are other manifestations of Purusha that are ephemeral. They are also manifestations of Purusha, but they are ephemeral, such as anything that we experience through the senses, through the mind and all of that. So once we begin to understand that an awareness from within begins to develop, we develop viveka khyatihi. But when our earning to develop that happens, then śraddhā, then vīryam comes. Then what Vyasa says, as explained by this, while explaining the sutra, because Patanjali's next word is smṛti. Smriti is memory. What memory is it? It says, as you practice this, memories of previous experiences come to life. There is a worship going on, so I will pause it for now. The worship, a particular ritual is done 4 times at 4 different times of the day. And so this was one of those important worship times, and therefore I had to interrupt the session. Nevertheless, so we spoke about śraddhā. Thanks. We spoke about śraddhā. We spoke about vīryam. So Vyasa says, when you have śraddhā, faith, and you begin your practice, then energy comes, enthusiasm comes. And when you practice with enthusiasm and energy, then what happens? Transformation begins to happen. Now this is an interesting thing. This is where the next word comes in, smṛti. So here Vyasa says, then you will begin to remember. You will begin to remember the previous experiences, the previous, and more importantly, the previous lessons that we have learned. The knowledge will begin to come. As mystical and as abstract as this may sound, you and I know that this is not outside of our experience. When we read a book, especially in the spiritual realm, when we meet somebody, when we listen to someone, and then things just click in place. Your heart knows, oh my gosh, this seems so right. This is something exactly what I was looking for, things like that. What is it actually doing? It is actually reinforcing a deeply held knowledge that you had. And then you say, aha, I get it now. I've known this before. It seems so natural, right? You have had this experience. I am sure you have had this experience. That is how we come across and find our gurus, we find a book, we find a teaching, and so on. Where does this happen? How does this happen? This is because in that path of spirituality, when we have an element of faith and we have eagerness and energy in our practice, then memory begins to come. Though in our case, having said that, it is not sustainable, it is not clear, it just comes and goes, right? But when we do this practice like this with śraddhā and vīrya, then the old memories come back. What is the oldest memory you think? That we are divine. That is, we have forgotten our divinity, right? We are not human beings trying to achieve divinity. We are divine beings trying to remember who we are. So the ultimate smṛti is that. That's why smṛti is one of the greatest vrittis, if you will. So smṛti is the ultimate remembrance, but in that path to that is there are so many other we begin to remember. For example, if you learned swimming in your childhood, or cycling in your childhood, or driving in your youth, you may not particularly remember the exact instructor who taught you the driving across the busy roads in India or the US or elsewhere. You may not remember the coach who taught you swimming, or you may not remember whether it was your sister or brother or your father who taught you that first time cycling. Now, you may not remember the actual events, but then you remember cycling, don't you? You remember swimming, don't you? You remember something that you learned in the childhood. Even though you may not have done cycling for, let's say, 2 decades, when you sit on a cycle, that memory kicks in. When you may not have done swimming or swam for let's say 10 years, but then the moment you jump into a pool, you will learn to swim. It is like that. The events could come back to your memory, and I'm talking of events much earlier than this life, in the past, the previous lives, events could come, you begin to recognize places, you begin to recognize people. Inexplicably, you can't explain this. There is no logic to these things, okay? Perhaps you might have experienced that. But more important than events and particular circumstances, we begin to remember the knowledge that we gained, which I think is much, much more important than an event. An event comes and goes, but what we learn from that is what remains with us. So we begin to remember that knowledge, and that begins to help us further in our spiritual progress. When you read a book, you just get it. Aha, I got it. When you listen to somebody, you say, okay, this is easy for me. I can just absorb it. I don't have any doubts. Where does that happen? How does that happen? Whereas somebody else will say, I have no idea what he's talking about. What is faith? What is all this nonsense? You know, you don't look down upon them because they are perhaps just starting and that memory has not clicked. They don't remember perhaps, or they don't have anything to remember. We don't know that. But in your case, in my case, in somebody else's case, we begin to remember. And then the journey gathers speed, right? So you have śraddhā, vīrya, smṛti, samādhi. Then the cognitive trances, the various steps in the cognitive trance begins to manifest. What are those steps? We learned that a couple of sutras, 2 or 3 sutras ago. Vitarka samādhi, vichāra samādhi, ānanda samādhi, asmita anugamat, ānanda anugamat, vichāra anugamat, vitarka anugamat. So these are all the different steps or different types of cognitive trances, samprajñāta samādhi. We have learned that, okay? So that samādhi begins to manifest at these different stages. In vitarka stage, in vichara stage, then ānanda and asmita begins to manifest, where all of these other things don't matter. The ritual, for example, is just a stepping stone. And then the experience takes over, the ānanda, the joy, the bliss that you get out of that takes over. And then you're lost in that samādhi. That's those kind of samādhis. There is nothing like, what am I getting out of this? There's no, the I begins to slowly disappear. And so therefore, that samādhi is a very beautiful trance-like state. So that begins to present itself. So you see the roadmap here. Patanjali talks of for itareṣām, for others, right? And once samādhi happens, then the viveka khyati presents itself. The cognitive trance, once the layers of cognitive trance becomes more and more apparent to us, then viveka khyati. Viveka khyati, as Vyasa explains, is that ultimate discernment. You're able to clearly see now what is impermanent, what is permanent, what is necessary, what is unnecessary from a spiritual point of view. That understanding, it's almost like getting enlightenment, I would think. That enlightened understanding, if you will, okay, let's use that term, that enlightened understanding, that enlightened discernment, when it descends upon us, then what happens, as Vyasa explains, param vairagyam takes place, a supreme form of vairagya. Again, we studied this also in the previous sutra, where we begin to get detached from the gunas themselves, gunavaitrishnyam. Gunavaitrishnyam, we begin to get detached from the gunas. When that begins to happen, then prajñā, the 5th word Patanjali used, prajñā comes. Prajñā is total enlightenment. That is asamprajñāta samādhi. In this case, instead of using asamprajñāta samādhi, Patanjali is used, what do you get there? So he indicates that. And Vyasa explains that in his commentary. He is talking about that stage. Prajñā, the highest wisdom, then comes to us. So don't lose heart. I wouldn't. Even if somebody tells me it takes 100 more lifetimes, I'll be glad that at least I'm on the path. And life is not too bad at the end of the day, right? We get caught in the bills to pay, in monetary difficulties, or in sicknesses and separations and all of these. Everything surrounding the little I seems very big. But when you understand that I itself is tiny, and therefore all of that surrounding the I cannot be that big, once that understanding comes, then you learn to step out of that I. You begin to witness the I. Witness, like this temple, Satchinathar Temple, where I'm learning this. This is the thought that comes to me. Learn to be a witness. Know that I am, so for me, I will say I am witnessing Sundar's life. Who am I? That will come later. But I am witnessing Sundar's life. be a witness. When that begins to happen, then the greater knowledge begins to present itself to us. So don't lose heart when you hear about advanced yogis, videhas, and prakriti layas, samprajñāta samādhi, asamprajñāta samādhi, nirbīja samādhi, sabīja samādhi, and trance-like states and all of that. That is where detachment has to come, or non-attachment, vairagya. Don't chase that, don't refuse that, but say detached, non-attached, if you will. Vairagya is a proper word. For me, English, it's always whether should I use detached or non-attached, but you get the point. But you get a state of vairagya and you just focus on abhyasa. It is very against our modern concept of education, where we say set a goal and aim for the goal and set targets to reach a goal. That has its place in the material plane, in the plane of the senses, in this dimension, physical dimension, in this world. Yes, we need to set a goal, we need to set a target, achieve it. All that is unquestionably correct. But unfortunately, or fortunately, that does not apply in the spiritual path. Why? Because in the spiritual path, the goal itself is very obscure. And therefore, I just set a vision of unending expansion and keep going and keep getting expanded. The river just does its nature of flowing towards the ocean. It does not spend time defining what the ocean is, what the goal is, and so on. The river simply focuses on its flow and keeps flowing. Eventually, it reaches the ocean. And when it reaches the ocean, it becomes the ocean. Śraddhā, vīrya, smṛti, samādhi, prajñāpūrvaka, itareṣām. As always, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share these wonderful pearls of wisdom with you all. Until we meet again, stay blessed, stay inspired. Namaste.
Kaivalya